All right, thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here. I think this is a really important topic because it's something that I wish somebody had explained to me early on in my career as a CISO or CSO. Um, so I spent the first 8 years of my career in the public sector and hadn't really paid attention to how corporations worked until I joined eBay at a senior director level. And so almost immediately I got exposure to how the exec team at my company was interacting with our board. And things have evolved dramatically since that time back in 2002. Over the last 21 years, the way that the board interacts um, has changed a lot. Um, if you go back to 2002 when I joined eBay, um, I think that was right around the time when Sarbanes-Oxley first started coming into play, and boards started getting really hands-on around the financial aspects and the discipline around being accurate on those financial aspects. When I tell people that when I joined eBay in 2002, it had been a public company for 4 years already, people scratch their head. But eBay was invented in fall of 1996 and went public in 1998. I don't know if we could imagine a company going public that quickly these days, but that was in the era before Sarbanes-Oxley. Since then, Sarbanes-Oxley came along and fundamentally changed expectations of executives and board members around the financial side. And I think we're going through a similar kind of evolution in the cybersecurity side. Nobody gave me a board book when I first had to present to the board. I remember I became the CSO at Facebook. So after I spent 7 years at eBay and PayPal, I went over to Facebook and I became the chief security officer. And I vividly remember my first appearance before the Facebook board because I was very nervous. I was petrified. I was, going before Mark and Cheryl, but also Mark Andreessen and Peter Thiel and Reed Hastings, the CEO of Netflix, and just some very highly respected people in Silicon Valley. And to have to go in front of them and speak about cybersecurity, I had no idea what their baseline understanding level would be, how to talk to them about security. I didn't really understand the business side of running a company very well back then. And so I didn't really know, what does a board of directors member do on a day in, day out basis? And especially what do they do when they think about cybersecurity? And so that's a long way of saying I think this is an important project. Every CISO who goes into the board needs to understand really a lot about how does a board fit in terms of governance of a company? How do I interact with the board? What are the appropriate ways? What are the pitfalls? And so I think this is a really important project because most of us most of us who've gone before a board haven't had a very clear map of what's expected. I also think that from one of the other important aspects of this project is we're not just looking at it from the perspective of the CISO presenting to the board, but we're also writing to the board as well. And so thinking about the role of the security executive engaging with the board from the perspective of the security leader, but also from the perspective of the board. And I think it's important also for us to understand the perspective of the other leaders of the company, the other executives. So just to wrap up on my career journey in terms of presenting to boards, it all culminated in when I got to my last company, Cloudflare. I was able to attend every single board meeting. The philosophy of our CEO at Cloudflare was that he wanted me to present at every single board meeting, and he invited me to sit through every board meeting. And I learned so much over the last 4.5 years, getting to sit in on and see how a board engages with the entire executive staff of the company. I wish every security leader could have that experience of being able to be a fly on the wall for the entire board meeting, because it puts the cyber stuff in context so much better. Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. Um, Communication is the most important thing, and I think that's what this whole book is going to be about in one aspect or another. Communication starts between individuals with speaking the same language, and all the homework isn't going to be in the board book. Every cyber leader needs to do more homework than we can put into this book in terms of learning how to communicate with their board and the other executives at their company. So, for example, very early on when I started going to board meetings, um, I was I was very quickly lost when people started looking at a P&L and talking about the P&L and what each line in the P&L meant. So much so that I went and took a class outside of work just to learn how to read a P&L. It was kind of like a 3 or 4 week session on going through the different aspects of a P&L for a non-business leader in a business. And so you have to be able to speak the language that the board is speaking in order to communicate with them. And as technical leaders, spending most of our time in that technical silo, we have to be very careful when we leave our silo and go talk to the other executives. Remember that they speak a different language, and they're expecting us to learn their language more than we should be expecting them to learn our language. So partially we need to learn their language, and partially we need to take our language and translate it into words that they understand. And I think we're getting better when it comes to quantifying risk and articulating that. But too often we lose the other business leaders and we lose the board when we go really deep into our cybersecurity lingo, so to speak.
Well, I think that cannot be overemphasized that we deal with a lot of details and nuances, especially on the technology side. That landscape is infinite, so to speak. The threat landscape is always changing, and finding the common language for the board members and the business to understand without overwhelming them with technical jargon, I think is going to be is key, as we have experienced ourselves, and hopefully the new generation of leaders come with that knowledge and understanding. So, Joe, just to take it a little bit to the next level in terms of specific areas of guidance you had put together for us and also discussed in the multiple meetings that we have had leading up to the initial board book draft, specific areas that you thought are more important. Could you bring up some of the insights from those topics?
Yeah, I think what we're seeing right now is kind of a really positive trend where cyber risk is becoming a priority for the board because of circumstances in the world, because every company is a company that operates in the digital world. But our board members often have moved on from being operators and now are full-time board members. And so they're not in the weeds of implementation of the new technologies like we are. So one example of a way that I've thought about our role is that we're not just there to communicate the risk, but we also need to find a way to become an educator for the board in our role as the security leader. So whereas like the CFO can walk into a board meeting and they don't need to educate the board on the terminology of the P&L, we still have an obligation as the experts to go in and educate. So a concrete example of how I've been doing that over the last few years was on my team, we called it a kind of like a sandwich. Every single board meeting when my team and I would present, we would always lead with kind of all of the metrics that tell like the history of the last quarter. So what's happened in the last quarter at our company from a cyber standpoint? and there might be the story of one or two specific attacks, but then there's the metrics of how we've done in terms of responding to vulnerabilities and proactive detection, et cetera. So, and then we would finish with the look forward. So we would start every session with the look back, and we would finish with the look forward and how we're thinking about risk and how we're prioritizing and what we hope to be able to show the board at the next meeting. But in the middle of that sandwich, between the look at the past and the look to the future, we would take a specific topic and we would go deep with the board. So it might be we're going to spend 15 minutes on ransomware, or we're going to spend 15 minutes on how we think about a particular type of risk. And sometimes that would be driven by what's been in the news over the last 90 days, and we know it's on the mind of the board. Anybody who's presented regularly before boards knows that invariably when you present, the board is going to ask a question about the big cyber event in the news in the last month. And so you kind of have to get ahead of that and remember that we're the most, hopefully, we're one of the most sophisticated people that the board hears from ever about cybersecurity. And so they're looking to you as the expert. And so that's why I always try and pack in the middle there a little kind of lesson for the board on an area.
Well, right, and I think that also gets the incremental knowledge and awareness, broadened across their their purview. So, Joe, when we went about putting this photo together, we looked at it in terms of the first 6 chapters was like um, what is the necessity and the necessary cyber expertise in the board, right? I think the house was very divided about that. You've been part of many of these conversations we have had. That we had friends and colleagues who thought that there must be a cybersecurity expert on the team or within the board, as much as it is a financial experts and legal experts and all that are there. And there are others who's thought it would be probably access to expertise, not necessarily having an expert on the board would be. Can you just throw a little bit of light on the two sides of this perspective?
Yeah, I think this is a topic that's going to get a lot more attention in the near future because the SEC has, I think, put out some requirements for boards to start articulating how much cybersecurity expertise there is on the board. And so, the interesting question will be how organizations respond to that. Will they try and train their existing board members on cybersecurity? Or will they try and bring more people onto the board who have cybersecurity expertise as from being practitioners? One of the questions that often comes up in kind of CISO only sessions is, why aren't there more CISOs on boards, given the escalated importance of this area? We are starting to see people with cybersecurity expertise get on boards more and more frequently. The number one reason I've heard why we don't have more practitioners going into that area is because there are no one-trick ponies on boards. You don't get selected to a board because you're really good at one area of risk. All of the board members of a company are expected to be all-around contributors. You can't just be good at one thing and get on boards. You have to be good at kind of the broader picture, and it has to be both sides of it. You have to be good at evaluating risk, but you also have to be someone who can help the business grow. When the CEO and existing board members think about how to expand their board, they're not thinking about, oh, we need to bring in someone who's really good at one thing only. They're thinking about, how do we bring in someone who's going to help us all be better across the board as a team? So they're not looking for one-trick ponies. And so I think we're going to see more situations where the cybersecurity leader who wants to be on a board has to become a well-rounded business leader, or we're going to end up with the other extreme. We're going to end up with a lot of business leaders who pick up the some level of cybersecurity expertise so they can be the person in that area. So I think there's a ton of debate within our profession, mostly by a lot of us who've never been on boards about what the boards should be like. But the more important perspective will be the perspective of, I think, the existing board members.
Absolutely. No, I think that's going to be very important for the cybersecurity industry to understand and align with, because businesses have been there forever, right? I mean, and the governance structures that are around it, and the expectations from the board, and the C-suite members who are participating as stakeholders and accountable management, members of the management working with the board. I think there is already a structure that's in place, and cybersecurity is a new entrant in this place. So we have to align with the existing, way that they operate. So this is a very important point that you made, Joe. Considering that there are only so many CISOs, let alone CISOs who have specific board expertise. What do you think would be kind of a practical guidance for organizations who are looking to have access to the cyber expertise from outside?
Yeah, I think it's going to be an interesting question whether they decide to bring onto the board people with concrete cyber experience, or whether they try and bring on consultants to the board. I know from prior experience interacting with boards and sitting in on those board meetings is it's not uncommon for the board members. Maybe one of them takes the lead in a particular area, even if they're not an expert, but then they bring in an outside consultant team to help them. So it may be like, your former employer or other, large consulting organizations that have a channel of expertise in that area. And so we may just see boards turning more and more to independent third-party auditors, asking them to be an extension of the board around cyber. And it may be that, the board will feel comfortable bringing in someone who has that level of cyber expertise themselves. But I just don't, board members, like if we think about the role of a board member, they participate in typically a day or two, they have a couple of days of meetings once every 3 months. They're not going to be able to, in their role as a board member, really roll up their sleeves, dig in individually, and evaluate the organization from a cybersecurity posture. Like that, if that's the expectation of the board member, then you don't understand how boards operate. So I don't think that we're going to all of a sudden see a board member who spends 100 hours a quarter digging into your cybersecurity. Much more likely, we're going to have someone who understands cybersecurity at a high level, who has people who are digging in the same way that the board relies on internal audit around financial abuses. There's going to be probably more likely to be the equivalent of an internal audit for cybersecurity, and we see variations of that in different industries already that have been around forever. But then in other industries, there's zero history of that.
Sure, and I think to just piggyback on that, I think there is an opportunity for us to actually structure this in a more thoughtful way than just answering the call right now. Okay, come and do a presentation and preparing for that. So with that, Joe, the next next item I want to bring up was also what we discussed around how the board is informed, and we have a specific chapter on that. And I think it would be probably good to give a background to the audience from your experience as to how they're typically informed beyond the presentations themselves.
Yeah, so there's, as we think about the role of the board, we need to think about, as the security leader, what are our expectations and obligations around communication? there are a lot of landmines for a security leader when they are engaging with the board, because you need to think about the dynamic as the board is not the same as the C-suite, even though they overlap. So you have oftentimes your CEO and your COO and maybe even your CFO are members of the board, but your CEO and your COO and the other executive team members, they kind of, I don't know what the right way to phrase this is, but they like to manage the board. And you have to so there's a dynamic where the CEO, the COO have a relationship with the board that, well, if you step back and you think about it, maybe this is helpful. The primary role of the board is to be the manager of the CEO in some respect. And I'm not saying this like I've read the law of how boards work, but it just seems like I've always heard that the CEO looks to the board like the board is the only person who can fire them, and the person who puts out the metrics for the CEO's success. And so that you have to remember that that's the dynamic between the CEO and the board. And if that's the dynamic between them, do you want to get in between them and be seen as taking sides between them? And how do you navigate all that? It's a fraught political situation that you're stepping into, and it varies dramatically based on the type of company, whether it's a private company or a public company, whether it's financial services or medical, or, there's different dynamic and expectations. If it's a founder CEO, like I've had the experience of working under, they view themselves as having selected their board and curated their board, which is very different from a CEO who was hired by the board. And so you have your own existing dynamic in terms of your communication with your CEO, and that hopefully is very clear in terms of whether you report to them or not and what information gets to them. And then you're injecting yourself or being invited into the conversation that's now becoming a triangle between your C-suite, your board, and you as the security executive. And so, I've heard lots of stories of of security leaders who've gotten in trouble with their CEO because they went to the board without communicating it to the CEO first. And so it was a big surprise when, the security leader pointed out a problem area to the board and caught the CEO off guard. That's probably not going to be a good look with your boss if you're making them look like they're not paying attention to a serious risk. So understanding the dynamic between these different organizations, how you fit in, is important. I've heard the dangers of bringing up a risk to the board that the CEO wasn't aware that you were going to communicate, but I've also heard the opposite of like not telling the board about things that you told the executives about, also causing trouble. So you got to figure out who to share what with when.
I think that's where probably is a model that is required, where there is an industry accepted norm as to where and how the communication needs to go, and by all means, hopefully this can be that forum. But in general, I think I completely agree with you in terms of how you can be caught in the middle, because the other chapter that we had also dug into very deeply was the direct access for the CISOs to the board, and what do you share, and through what escalation mechanisms you follow to share those specific risks which are not being addressed by the management who hired you. So I think there's this independent professional ethics that we have to follow as professionals in this particular industry, which probably can be borrowed from the legal industry or from the financial industry. I mean, our profession, those two professions have been part of this ecosystem for much longer than the security professionals have been. So I think this might be another angle to look at a little bit more deeply, have a structured engagement model. And that brings us to the next item that before we dig into the case study, we'll probably touch upon is the decision metrics, right? I think we don't really have a decision metrics. Every CISO has their own decision metrics as to what to bring up to, and typically they it will be brought up to initially in financial industry and other industries which have a little bit more mature security posture, have risk management committees and steering committees that actually look at this in a broader lens. But in most organizations, and I think it is fair to say in the majority of the organizations, we don't really have that security decision metrics, right? So it's dependent on the CISO's point of view and their experience, how they share with that. So any quick thoughts around that, and what can we include in that security in the decision metrics that supports a board communication?
Yeah, I think there's in our conversations as a group, we've identified two completely separate areas where we need to establish expectations up front. One is around the general dialogue around risk. What frameworks are we going to use to communicate risk? What metrics? What cadence? What level of granularity? I think it's important to have that dialogue, and then to keep having that dialogue as your board kind of matures in their cybersecurity expertise over time. But the other area that was, I think, really interesting in our conversations was around incident response. It's an interesting thing to, the board is not an operating team inside the company. In fact, I think there are boundaries in terms of how actively a board can get involved in day-to-day operations of the company. But the real risk in cybersecurity happens when there's an incident. And it's funny, I live very close to Stanford University, and they have this program where they bring in board members and other people to kind of train them on how to handle a security incident. And I remember the first time I went to this exercise and participated in kind of like a mock security incident, and people were divided into different roles. And it was designed to get the board members to think like, okay, now for this exercise, you act like the CTO, you act like the CEO, you act like the security leader, and then expose them to the information that you'd have available during that time in an incident. And I remember thinking, wow, I've never seen a board this actively involved in a security incident, or I never saw a protocol which said the security leader needed to make sure that the board was involved and informed when a security incident was unfolding, as opposed to afterwards. And so I started talking to a couple of CEOs, and I learned that there's kind of an informal practice in some contexts by CEOs. When things start getting dicey in any area, it's not uncommon for the CEO to reach out to the board and to have them in the loop. And so I think that's an important question for each of us as security leaders. How, like, when we're preparing as an incident's unfolding, a big part of our job as a security leader is to make sure that communication is happening across the organization in the right way. Sometimes it's lock things down because of the sensitivity, and other times it's in other channels, it's like get the information out quickly, even though we don't know a lot of facts for real yet. And so, like, an interesting question is, in your organization, what is the structured way, and has there been a conversation with the board about when and how they should be informed about security incidents?
Yeah, and I think that is indicative of also the overall risk management, crisis management, communications management of many other typical business operations issues that you would have. And as things progress, hopefully this also gets to a point where if not that the security incident is not predictable, but the way you approach it is predictable and already clearly defined, and definitely helps to address security issues in a more pragmatic way. This brings us to the case study. And Joe, when we discussed about specific case studies to bring to the fore, where we can shed the light on specific cybersecurity issues as it relates to the board decisions, you thought about FTX Group as an issue, right? Can you give a little bit of your insights onto your reading to that particular FTX Group's issue, and also what is the takeaway from that particular case study you mentioned?
Yeah, it's funny. Most often when we think about cybersecurity risk, we anchor in cybersecurity cases that made it to the media, right? And we talk about and we frame and use those as our examples of areas where we need to do more, and that we can learn and model against. But I think that the FTX case is a really good case study. Obviously, it's still unfolding because there are charges against the CEO. So just and we're kind of in this like news cycle where something becomes everything we pay attention to in the news for a few days, and then it moves on. And FTX is kind of faded from the news a little bit. But like if we go back to last November, it was it was the beginning of what everyone was calling the crypto winter, because FTX really fell apart, and their CEO got arrested, and it was all over the news. All the cryptocurrencies took a major hit in their value. All of the companies that are in the crypto space took a major hit, and it was all because the media and congressional hearings and everything highlighted for us the lack of governance inside FTX. And so I'm not sure everybody thought of FTX as a cybersecurity governance situation. I bet you most of you didn't. But if you look a little closer, one of the things I noticed was when a new CEO was brought in, named John Ray. He was brought in, and they said that his job as the CEO was to try and figure out, can you keep FTX running? But more importantly, can you resolve all the open issues for debtors? So he had to kind of go in and like figure out how much money's left, how do we use it, how do we run this company, how do we take care of what our commitments are. And when you read what John Ray said when he went to go testify before Congress, I found it fascinating. I don't often go read congressional testimony, but there was something that I saw in his remarks that made me want to dig deeper. So you can find online his written testimony. And in his written testimony before Congress, he started by saying this organization had fundamental failings. And the first two failings he listed was, he said, quote, the use of computer infrastructure that gave individuals and senior management access to systems that stored customer assets, without security controls to prevent them from redirecting the assets. That was risk failure number one of FTX. Risk failure number two of FTX, they stored certain private keys that access hundreds of millions of dollars in crypto without effective security and controls or encryption. Like, to me, it was astonishing. Those are cybersecurity controls. Those are the things that a CISO should be at least reporting to the board and the exec team their existing posture on, and they should be committed to trying to address those risks. And so it made me think, wow, if FTX had proper cybersecurity controls in place, both of these issues would have been in a fundamentally different place. So I think that it was really, I felt like it was a really important case study, because it shows that cybersecurity hygiene is at the core of corporate hygiene, period. And a case that has nothing to do in the headlines with cybersecurity actually has everything to do with cybersecurity.
Well, that's great to have the deeper dive, because I think these two areas also highlight that, if a incoming CEO comes in, or a management team comes in and are able to immediately land on, as fundamental and foundational issues as this, then it's actually, shows that it doesn't take too much to understand and be aligned with business on the foundations of cyber hygiene. And I think that's probably the starting point of our journey in general, for Cyber Board Book. And Joe, thanks for bringing not only your experience and insight in, but also digging into this specific case study, which I believe will shed the light on the basics that need to be done, the basics that can get you in trouble, but also, could just undermine the entire business if they're not followed correctly. You don't even have to go into the details and the nitty gritties of the technicalities of the threat reports or threat intelligence and SOC reports, or vulnerabilities. You can go by the top level business practices. So again, Joe, this has been very helpful. Thank you for kicking off and introducing the Cyber Board Book initiative, and also your thoughts. Thank you for the great work that you do, especially with the new role with the Ukraine Friends. I think very much aligned to the mission and challenges that we have taken on. As a leadership community, I think we are trying to address and identify meaningful answers to and meaningful and practical answers to specific problems. The cyber board engagement is definitely one of the key ones, and we hope to continue this dialogue, and take the initial framework that you have laid out in this first chapter through the next six chapters that we have. So for those that are joining us for the first time, and also please stay tuned. We have six chapters that we have put together. Joe has been a contributing author for most of them, along with this initial introduction. What we'll do in the coming weeks is to share with you the first couple of chapters, as we also have a very exciting forward and a broader business introduction adding to this. So as we go forward, please stay tuned. Please join us in the subsequent webcasts, as we'll bring more and dig into the specific areas of cyber board engagement. Thank you all for joining. Thank you, Joe, specifically for your time and contribution, as well as all the work that you do. Thank you all again.
Thank you.
Thank you. This.